I started learning about the Mormon church when I was 16 and living in England. I had a friend who was Mormon and his family was really great. So when they invited me over to their house for dinner and said the missionaries would be there, I was down. I was agnostic at the time, having grown up in a non-religious family like most people in England. And so I listened to their little missionary lesson and then just kind of forgot about it. Then about a year later, my friend and her mum told me that they were going to get missionary lessons to learn more about our Mormon friends' religion, and it was going to be 6 lessons and they'd, you know, learn more. And I wanted to do that too. I think partly just because I loved my Mormon friends' family so much, and also just because I was curious. I had liked RE lessons in school and found them fascinating, and so this just kind of seemed like something like that. Me and my friend and her mum didn't really see it as a thing where they'd be trying to convert us. We just saw it as a way to learn more about this religion that someone we loved was a part of. So cute. So me and my friend and her mum started getting the missionary lessons and quickly realized that it was very much about trying to convert us. And so my friend and her mum stopped having them pretty soon after that, but I kept going. I'd grown up in a pretty turbulent household. My parents got divorced when I was 12, and since the age of about 12 I just lived alone with my mum, which was tough. And so this family that was so loving and seemed so happy was obviously very appealing to me. I was very enamored by the idea that a family could be so happy and loving. They were also just good people and they were extremely nice to me, and so even though as I was getting the missionary lessons I did feel pressure from the missionaries, which I didn't love, I kept going. I remember at one point I was talking to one of my atheist friends about the whole thing. He was very into science, and I was telling him like I just felt so much pressure from the missionaries to keep learning more about Mormonism, you know, to join the Mormon church. And I was, you know, recognizing that they were applying pressure tactics, even though they were nice about the way they do it. And my friend told me, you just need to cut them off. And I remember being in that conversation and thinking, yeah, I do need to cut them off, and I had a plan to do that. And I think I tried to do that, but was ultimately too weak to withstand the pressure of missionaries and the loving pressure of my friend, I guess. So I didn't cut them off, I kept learning more. Then one night I went to a birthday party. It was my friend's 17th birthday party and everyone there was drunk. But I got so drunk because I was a little 16-year-old who didn't know their limits with alcohol and probably shouldn't have been drinking alcohol anyway, but it's England and I was 16. I got so drunk that my mum had to come get me from the party, which obviously, like, mums get mad about that stuff, rightly so. And I remember waking up the next day and just feeling like shit, because I was like, my mum's mad at me, all my friends are mad at me for kind of like ruining the party and like taking things too far and like creating drama. And in my little 16-year-old head at the time, it just felt like my world had come crashing down and everything sucked. So when my Mormon friend texted me and said, hey, do you want to come to church? I thought sure, mostly just to escape having to see my mum that morning. I think she was out at the store at the time, and so I was like, yeah, if I go to church then I won't have to see her for ages. So I went to church, and my friend had instructed the missionaries to teach us investigators about the word of wisdom that day. For those of you who don't know, the word of wisdom is kind of a Mormon code of health, because of which Mormons don't drink tea or coffee or alcohol and some other stuff too. So I learned about the word of wisdom, and because obviously in that moment I hated alcohol because it had, you know, ruined my night and felt like it had ruined my life at the time, and I was probably a little bit hungover at church. And so I decided I'm gonna live this from now on. Not because I necessarily thought the Mormon church was true or anything, I guess I just thought there was value in the word of wisdom, and honestly I was pretty impressionable. I then spent the rest of that Sunday at my Mormon friend's house with his family and just had a really lovely, peaceful day. It was kind of a sanctuary at that time from everything else that was going on in my dramatic little 16-year-old world, and it just felt nice to feel loved and cared about by this family that I thought was so great. And obviously Mormons teach that feelings of happiness and peace are the spirit, so when I was voicing how good I felt, they were quick to tell me what that meant, which is the Mormon church is true, you know, in whatever way they would have said that. And so after that day, I sort of started thinking maybe there's something to this Mormon thing. I kind of started wanting to identify with the label Mormon. My foot was in the door. So I kept learning more and getting closer and closer to being Mormon. And there wasn't really a set point, a clearly defined point where I was like, okay, the Mormon church is true. But, you know, confirmation bias and various experiences and the love bombing of my friend's Mormon family and other people in the ward And just being young and impressionable meant that I took on the teachings of Mormonism more and more and started thinking it was true. I had a lot of experiences in those early days that to me at the time were like, this church is true, like this is proof. You know, the kind of experiences that Mormons make the cornerstone of their testimony. Experiences that at the time I was like, I could never deny that this means this, because I didn't know any better about, you know, the psychology of religious belief and those types of experiences and how prevalent they are across all religions, even like juxtaposing religions and stuff like that. My lighting feels off. And so essentially I just became more and more converted as time went on. I even got my young women's medallion, this isn't it, I don't know why I'm touching it, in a year because I was just so obsessed with Mormonism, and I would go teaching with the missionaries, and I was honestly just like a dream convert for any warden, any missionaries. So converted that I ended up moving from England to attend Brigham Young University, Idaho, a Mormon university in a state I never heard of because I was just so Mormon. I also got into BYU Provo, which is the better school, but I felt like it wasn't the right school for me. Mostly because I just didn't know anyone in Utah. At BYU Idaho, I spent 3.5 years being very, very Mormon, and I loved it. I was a Relief Society teacher, I was a straight A student who loved religion classes, and I was usually the first person that wanted to get up and bear their testimony in fast and testimony meeting. Not like the first, because that person's always a little bit, but you know. I even remember being kind of disappointed when I got to BYU Idaho that people weren't more Mormon, because I'd only been Mormon for like 1 or 2 years, and so I thought, oh, I've only had such a short period of time, like I'm so imperfect, these people are going to be like light years ahead of me. And what I realized was that these people had grown up in Mormonism and they weren't any more Mormon than me, even though they had obviously come from much more Mormon backgrounds, and there were certain things that were more Mormon, but I didn't have the kind of view where I thought Mormonism meant being absolutely crazy. Like some of the truly crazy religious people at BYU Idaho I didn't see as like a higher form of the gospel, if that makes sense. Even though I was, now looking back, very crazy and very, very religious. More so than most people at BYU Idaho, I would say. I remember feeling disappointed at stuff like people only fasting for 12 hours on Fast Sunday, whereas I would fast for 24 hours and just crap like that. Once I graduated college, I became a popular Mormon blogger. I started this website with my friend called Millennial Mormons. It was the worst thing ever. It makes me cringe to this day to think about the stuff I wrote. I did a social media internship at Deseret Book. I wrote for LDS Living, which is a church-owned publication. I was even quoted in the New York Times in an article about Joseph Smith's polygamy, where I was kind of defending Joseph Smith's polygamy, because at the time the church had just finally, after all this time, admitted that Joseph Smith had up to 40 wives. Like, they knew it all along, but they didn't admit it till they were forced to by the internet. So just very, very Mormon. And then I started learning more about Mormon history through my good friend Tanner, some of you may know him, who was A, the most obedient and faithful Mormon I knew, and B, going through a faith crisis. I had thought I knew a lot about church history before then, because I really was very diligent about reading stuff. Like, I was pretty obsessed with Mormonism. I was definitely the type of person that read my scriptures every single day and like read Mormon stuff for fun, like read Jesus the Christ at 17 in my spare time, stuff like that. But what I realized was that I really didn't know that much about Mormon history. I had just kind of heard this skewed narrative of what it had looked like. So once I started learning more, I was disturbed by the reality of polygamy, for example, and what it actually looked like in the lives of these women who were coerced into living it. And I was very disturbed by the fact that the church had been so racist up till the 70s, and honestly still is in so many major ways. I was disturbed by Joseph Smith and his history of being a conman and a treasure seeker, and how many prophecies he made that didn't come true, like how many obvious lies he told. I was really disturbed by the modern LDS church, which I saw as being very pharisaical, and I was disturbed by a whole lot more. That is just like a very brief smattering of the things that started to bother me. But I was so devoted to Mormonism, and I couldn't imagine a universe where the LDS church wasn't true. I didn't read any of this stuff and think that I was going to reach any kind of conclusion that the church wasn't true. I just figured I needed to keep learning more, keep being faithful, praying, studying, and eventually answers would come. And this was kind of just like a test of my faith, and I was going to be stronger because of it. So I dove into reading only church-approved sources, because the church doesn't like you to read anti-Mormon sources or sources not approved by them. But I read stuff like the Journal of Discourses and Mormon Doctrine and General Conference talks from the past. I was learning a lot from Tanner too, who was obsessed with reading the biographies of prophets, stuff like that. I was just learning a lot of new information at this time. and truly believed that the church was true, that was set. I didn't even consider the possibility of the church not being true because in my mind at that time, it was inconceivable, to be honest. During this period of time where I was learning more about Mormon history and Mormonism in general, I got married in a Mormon temple and I was convinced that I'd be Mormon forever because that was my whole world. I tried really, really hard to reconcile the new information that I was learning with my faith because my faith was everything. And what I discovered was that it became harder and harder to do that. I was realizing that it wasn't just that these men leading the church had been imperfect or made mistakes. It was that there was a consistent pattern of deceit and that the narrative told by the church is just not true, even according to their own sources that they have, that any Mormon can go look at and not feel are anti-Mormon. To cut a 5-month story short, I eventually realized that I couldn't do enough mental gymnastics anymore to believe that the LDS church was true, and believe me, I tried. I tried to justify so much bad shit to keep my faith. Like, I was willing to justify things that now I'm like, that should be an instant red flag, like that is morally repulsive. But I was willing to do anything for the church to be true, but it just wasn't. God had failed to answer my prayers, pleading with him for answers or at least comfort, and there was no way it could be true. I couldn't believe in a God who had commanded a 36-year-old prophet to marry a 14-year-old girl, and I couldn't believe in a God who had allowed racist prophets to teach racist doctrines while saying that this is God's will, God told me this, thus saith the Lord. And I couldn't believe in the Book of Mormon, which is rife with historical anachronisms and is obviously plagiarized from these books that you can look at that were available in Joseph Smith's time to him. And I couldn't believe in the Book of Abraham, which Joseph Smith said was a translation of these ancient papyri that he'd bought, but now we have the Rosetta Stone and we can translate the papyri and it has nothing to do with the Book of Abraham. And Mormon apologists try and be like, he was just inspired by the papyri, but it's like, no, Joseph Smith said this is a translation of these papyri. Like, all the apologetic arguments for Mormonism, or a lot of them, go so against what prophets taught, you know, very solidly. So I'm condensing so many issues into a very short explanation here, but there were too many issues. The church just couldn't be true anymore. It just became so obvious to me that it was demonstrably false. If you want a more comprehensive look at what the issues are, I think cesletter.com is a good resource, but even that doesn't contain all of them. Like, even that is kind of condensed relative to how much there actually is. Also, by this point, I'd learned enough about the psychology of religious belief to know that anyone can believe anything if the conditions are right. And me being someone that grew up in, you know, a turbulent home and had always longed for belonging, community, meant that the conditions were absolutely right for me to join a high demand religion. I remember reading that people in their late teens who are intellectuals are the most likely group to join a high demand religion or cult, and I was absolutely that demographic. So leaving the Mormon church at the time was extremely devastating to me. Like, the church not being true was my worst nightmare and I was living it. But over time I realized what an amazing decision it was, and obviously broke a lot of the conditioning that made it so devastating for me to leave the LDS church. Like, when you leave a high demand religion, even if you realize that the truth claims you'd once believed in are false, you still have so much conditioning. So it's pretty much always going to be devastating, especially because you're losing, like, your God, your community, all these things. It's crushing to have your whole worldview dissolve. Like, you feel so lost and confused. But as I said, over time I've just been happier and happier that I left the LDS church. Like, I don't even recognize the version of me that was Mormon anymore. It's so hard to kind of journey back to that place in my mind and realize that that was me. And I've also learned throughout this whole process that we're all just the products of our genetics and conditioning. And when you understand that, you're able to have the kind of forgiveness for yourself and others that spiritual teachers throughout history, like Buddha and Jesus, have taught. Because when you realize that we're all just the products of our genetics and conditioning, you realize that we're all acting the best we can in accordance with what we know. The people who do even kind of the worst things have usually had the worst lives. Like, their brains don't operate in the way that someone's brain would operate if they'd had a healthier upbringing or whatever, for example. This is a whole other topic I could go into. I hope I'm doing a decent enough job of just touching on it in this video, but I just wanted to mention that because I feel like it's so important to understanding why someone would join the Mormon church. And why people who are raised in it stay in it, obviously. There's a reason that people don't tend to leave the religions they were raised in. So even though leaving the Mormon church was easily one of the hardest things I've ever done, it was unbelievably formative and helpful for my personal development. Because when you have an experience where you realize that your entire worldview is wrong, you know, everything you believe about yourself and the world and your place in it, everything you believe about how to determine truth in the world or what's good or bad, when all of that stuff just gets pulled out from under you, when your whole worldview comes crashing down, you really learn a lot about critical thinking. Like, I'm such a better thinker, I suppose, because of the experience of realizing that everything I believed was wrong. I don't know that many people in the world get to have such a worldview destroying experience, and I think it's so beneficial. So I really wouldn't change the fact that I joined the Mormon church for anything. I'm so happy with how this story arc of my life has played out, and I truly believe I'm a better person because of it. I've been able to dive into my own conditioning in ways that I never would have even imagined while Mormon, and I've been able to understand how my past affects the person I am in the present, and in doing that I've been able to kind of gain more control of my own brain. This has been a very, very condensed version of my story, which obviously has so many other facets to it than I could explain in a 20-30 minute video, but I hope this gave you a good general understanding of why I joined the Mormon church, why I left it too, and I hope I've explained things well enough to portray my story accurately. Obviously, I'm very aware that Mormons are going to be defensive and are going to, you know, listen to my story and be like, you just joined the church because of a family that you loved, or, you know, you never had a real testimony, or you know, there's all these reasons that people in high demand religions will give for why people leave them, and the reasons will never really acknowledge, no, they just genuinely stopped thinking it was true, and they didn't sin, they weren't lazy, it wasn't anything like that, they just learned more and realized that they didn't believe that anymore. It's very common for people in high demand religions and cults to vilify people who leave. Disaffected members of cults, for example, are the most effective way at getting people in the cult out of the cult. So it is a bit daunting putting my story out there and knowing that there will be those who tear holes in it and perhaps think I'm being disingenuous in certain ways, but that's just the reality of leaving a high demand religion. Like, people are gonna demonize you, and not everyone. I'm not saying that all Mormons are terrible and are gonna do that. There's definitely tons that are great, and I think the younger generation of Mormons is so much better about people leaving, and I just think the younger generation of Mormons is better in general. They're so much less racist and homophobic and all that stuff than their parents and grandparents were. But again, that's a whole other video. This is getting very long. That's the end of my story. If you have your own and you want to share it, please do so in the comments. Regardless of what religious persuasion you are, just be nice to each other. We're just humans trying our best with what we know and how we perceive things. I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, I hope you're taking care of yourself. And if you have any questions, also just let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them.